Some places hide their secrets well. Others let them fester, growing darker with time. And then there are places where the secrets become louder than the silence. Deep in the Bavarian countryside, surrounded by endless fields of snow and shadowed forests, there was a farm. To some, it was a home. To others, it was a warning. In 1922, something happened at that farm, something so chilling, so unexplainable, that it left an entire country haunted for generations. But what happened there didn't come suddenly. It began slowly, subtly. A creak in the floorboards, footsteps where no one should be, a trail of footprints that led nowhere. This is a story of isolation, of fear, and of the dark things that linger just out of sight. A story that begins with whispers and ends with silence. Welcome to Hinterkaifeck. The snow fell in soft, quiet drifts, muffling the world in stillness. But silence has a way of amplifying the things we try to ignore. The Hinterkaifeck farm was more than a home. It was a world of its own, surrounded by endless wilderness and isolation. Its wooden beams, worn from decades of brutal winters, creaked in the cold. For Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, this house was his kingdom, a fortress that protected his family, but also kept the rest of the world at bay. Andreas was a man shaped by the land. His hands were like stone, thick and calloused, hardened by years of labor. He carried himself with an air of authority, but his demeanor was sharp, cutting. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words often stung more than comforted. To his family, Andreas was a provider, but he was also a storm, unpredictable and unyielding. His wife, Cecilia, was his opposite in many ways. Though years of hard living had dulled her youthful spirit, her hands still moved with purpose. She was the quiet heart of the household, always smoothing over the cracks Andreas left in his wake. She had spent her life on the farm, tending to its endless demands, and her weary smile spoke of a deep, unspoken love for her children and grandchildren. Despite her warm demeanor, there was a quiet sadness in her eyes, a weariness from years of sacrifice. Their daughter Victoria was different. At 35, she had already endured more hardship than most. Widowed young, she had returned to her family's farm with her two children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. Victoria was strong-willed, fiercely protective of her children, and carried a quiet dignity that contrasted with her father's harshness. But beneath her calm exterior, there was a sadness she tried to hide, a longing for a life beyond the cold walls of Hinterkaifeck. The children were the light of the farm, their laughter a fleeting reminder of innocence. Little Cecilia was curious and full of life, her wide eyes constantly scanning her surroundings as if the world was one great mystery to solve. She was a daydreamer who loved to hum little songs to herself, her voice breaking the eerie silence of the farm. Joseph, just a toddler, was the center of Victoria's world. His cries often echoed through the farmhouse, a sharp, raw sound that reminded everyone he was still learning to navigate life. To his mother, he was a symbol of hope, of a future not yet written. The first snowfall of March draped Hinterkaifeck in a hushed stillness. The air felt sharper, heavier, as if it carried something unseen. Andreas Gruber stood outside, staring at the trail of footprints in the snow. They led from the forest, straight to the farmhouse door. His chest tightened. There were no prints leading away. He tightened his grip on the axe in his hand. The farmyard was empty, the barn quiet. The world felt frozen in time, but Andreas couldn't shake the feeling that the house was holding its breath. That same morning, the engine repairman arrived. He was a sturdy man, used to the cold, but the chill at Hinterkaifeck seemed to bite deeper. Andreas greeted him tersely, his shoulders stiff, his eyes darting toward the edges of the farm. "It's in the shed," Andreas muttered, leading the way. The repairman followed, uneasy. He could feel it. The silence wasn't normal. As he worked on the engine, Andreas hovered nearby, the axe never far from his hand. Finally, Andreas spoke. "Ever hear footsteps in the attic?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. The repairman stopped, glancing over his shoulder. "Footsteps?" Andreas nodded. "Not rats. Too heavy, too slow." The repairman forced a laugh. "Probably the wood settling. Old houses make noises." Andreas didn't laugh. "It's not just noises. Keys go missing. Tools move on their own. And those..." He pointed to the footprints, visible through the shed's frosted window. "They lead here, but they never leave." The repairman felt his pulse quicken. He tried to focus on the engine, but the air felt heavier with every breath. When he finished, Andreas paid him quickly. "Lock up when you leave," Andreas muttered, already heading back to the house. The repairman glanced at the barn, its dark interior yawning like a mouth. The animals stirred uneasily inside, their low cries carrying on the wind. Something was wrong here, but he didn't ask. He left quickly, not daring to look back. March 31st, 1922. The farm was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that tightens around you, pressing into your chest. A silence that knows something is coming. The day passed uneventfully, but by evening, the stillness felt wrong. The animals seemed to sense it. The cows shifted restlessly in their stalls, low moans breaking the air. The chickens huddled in tight groups, their feathers fluffed defensively, clucking softly as though trying to warn one another. Outside, the family dog paced nervously, its growls low and sharp, ears pinned flat. Inside the house, Victoria stood at the kitchen table, kneading dough in practiced motions. The fire crackled faintly in the hearth, its light flickering across the walls. Little Kazelia sat at the table, humming softly as she braided her doll's hair. The sound, innocent and sweet, felt like it didn't belong, an intrusion into the heavy air. Andreas sat by the window, sharpening his axe. The metallic scrape echoed through the room in slow, rhythmic strokes. His gaze remained fixed on the tree line outside, dark and unmoving. His grip on the axe tightened with each pass of the whetstone. Then came the sound, a low, dragging noise, wood scraping against stone, faint but deliberate. Andreas froze mid-motion, his knuckles white against the axe handle. "What is it?" Victoria asked. "Stay here," Andreas ordered, his voice sharp, leaving no room for argument. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. The barn door stood slightly ajar, swaying gently in the windless night. The dog let out a sharp bark and then retreated behind the house, whining faintly as it disappeared into the shadows. Andreas ignored it, his focus on the barn. He stepped into the yard, the cold biting at his face. The cows groaned softly from inside the barn, their hooves clattering against the wooden floor as they shifted uneasily. The chickens stirred, their clucking nervous and disjointed. Even the silence of the farm felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Andreas approached the barn, the lantern in his hand casting a pale circle of light. The sour smell struck him first, sharp and cloying, a mix of wet hay and something rancid. He stepped inside, the lantern trembling slightly in his grip. Inside the house, Victoria froze. The sound from the barn was faint but chilling. She turned toward her mother, her face pale. "Father?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. "I'll go," she said, though her hands were already trembling. She grabbed the spare lantern from the counter and stepped into the night. The cold hit her like a wall, and the silence seemed to amplify every sound, the crunch of her boots in the snow, the faint creak of the barn door swinging in the breeze. The dog barked again, this time from inside the house. Victoria glanced back, but she forced herself forward. She stepped into the barn, the lantern trembling in her grip. Its weak glow cast jagged shadows along the walls. "Father?" she whispered. The beam of light landed on Andreas's crumpled form. Her breath hitched, and she staggered backward, her scream caught in her throat. Before she could move, there was a shift, a shadow rising from the corner. The lantern fell from her hands, and darkness swallowed her. One by one, the others came. Cecilia's grandmother moved next, shuffling toward the barn with trembling hands. Her footsteps were slow, hesitant, but she didn't return. Little Cecilia followed not long after. Her doll hung loosely from her hand as she stepped into the barn, her small frame dwarfed by the looming shadows. Her cries echoed briefly before being cut off. The maid, Maria, was the last. She didn't even make it to the barn. Inside the house, the animals grew eerily quiet. The dog whined one last time before retreating to the farthest corner. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the blood-soaked ground in a thin white blanket. For 4 days, the farm stood still. The smoke curled from the chimney, the livestock cried out in hunger, and the snow continued to fall. But no one answered the door, and no one noticed what lay behind it. By April 4th, neighbors began to worry. Victoria, usually devout in her church attendance, hadn't been seen. Little Cecilia hadn't shown up at school. The farm was unnervingly quiet, except for the animals. The cows' mournful bellows echoed across the yard, and the chickens' anxious clucks seemed to warn of something unseen. Even the family dog, normally energetic, had gone silent. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor, decided to investigate. He brought 2 men with him, uneasy about approaching the farm alone. The barn door was closed, but unlatched. As they stepped closer, the dog barked once sharply from inside the house, then fell silent again. The men exchanged uneasy glances before pushing open the barn door. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound splitting the heavy air. Inside, the stench hit them, a rancid wave of decay that clawed at their throats and filled their lungs. "Over here," one of the men said, his voice shaking. He pointed to a pile of hay near the back of the barn. Slowly, with trembling hands, they pulled back the hay. Beneath it lay the bodies of Andreas, Victoria, little Cecilia, and her grandmother. Their heads had been brutally crushed, blood soaking into the wooden boards beneath them. Little Cecilia's hand was clenched tightly, holding a tuft of her own hair, a silent scream frozen in her lifeless form. Lorenz staggered back, his lantern flickering as his grip faltered. "There's more," he whispered hoarsely. Inside the house, the nightmare continued. Joseph, the youngest, lay in his crib, his skull shattered with horrifying precision. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had just begun her job the day before the murders, was found dead in her room. Her belongings were still neatly packed. The house was a tomb, frozen in time, the stench of death clinging to every corner. As the police combed through the property, they uncovered chilling details. In the attic, they found signs that someone had been living there. Disturbed straw, faint scratches on the floorboards, and the same sour smell that filled the barn and house. And then, the most haunting revelation: the killer had stayed. For days after the murders, someone had tended the livestock, eaten meals, and kept the fireplace burning. The animals had been fed while the family lay dead. Whoever committed this crime hadn't fled. They had lingered. The investigation turned up no clear suspect. Andreas had mentioned a missing house key weeks before the murders, but it was never recovered. The footprints leading to the house stopped at the door, with none leading away. And though many suspects were questioned, including Victoria's rumored lover and local vagrants, no one was ever convicted. The Hinterkaifeck farm was eventually abandoned, its buildings demolished, but the land itself feels heavy even now, a place where the air still carries the weight of what happened.